It was supposed to be just another quiet Monday morning at Crestwood High. The students shuffled and half awake, the halls echoing with laughter and whispers. But when Ms. Alana Brooks, the new substitute teacher, walked into her first class, the room fell silent for a moment. Tall, calm and confident, she carried herself with a quiet grace that demanded respect. But a few students saw her composed demeanor as weakness. Within minutes, snide remarks started flying. By lunch, things had escalated into a cruel prank. When the bullies cornered her near the lockers, tearing her shirt in front of everyone, they thought they'd broken her. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that the woman they'd just humiliated wasn't just a teacher. She was a national Taekwondo champion who had spent years mastering both her body and her mind. And in that moment, standing in the ruins of their arrogance, Ms. Brooks decided it was time to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The first day at Crestwood High had a quiet tension that only newcomers could feel. Ms. Alana Brooks walked through the front doors carrying a folder pressed against her chest, her posture straight, her steps measured. She wasn't just here to teach, she was here to start over. Years of hard-earned discipline had molded her into someone who could handle pressure, but high school hallways were a different kind of battlefield. The buzzing chatter, the sound of sneakers squeaking across polished floors, and the faint scent of teenage perfume and cafeteria food all blended into a reminder that she was stepping into an environment ruled by youthful energy and unchecked egos. As she entered her classroom, her eyes swept across rows of curious faces. Some students smiled politely, others slouched with boredom, and a few exchanged glances that spoke of mischief. She greeted them with a calm voice, writing her name neatly on the board, Ms. Brooks, English Literature. The chalk squeaked slightly, breaking the silence, and a few snickers came from the back of the room. Her attire was simple but elegant, cream blouse, black slacks, and a subtle necklace that hinted at her composed personality. She began the lesson with warmth, asking about their favorite books, trying to make a connection. But it didn't take long before she noticed the undercurrent of mockery. A tall boy with an expensive haircut whispered something to his friend, and laughter rippled through a corner of the room. Another student rolled her eyes every time Ms. Brooks spoke. She ignored it gracefully, but inside, she could sense the familiar sting of disrespect. The kind that comes when people mistake kindness for weakness. It wasn't new to her. Life had thrown far harsher challenges her way. Still, she felt the weight of the room pressing against her patience. Testing her composure, as the hours passed, she continued teaching, her voice steady, her manner unbothered. Yet the group of troublemakers grew bolder, whispering, snickering, and exchanging glances. It started with subtle comments about her clothes, then evolved into open laughter when she turned to write on the board. The rest of the class seemed caught between discomfort and amusement, too afraid to intervene. By the time the lunch bell rang, Brooks could tell that her authority was being quietly eroded. She gathered her things, took a slow breath, and reminded herself that every challenge could be turned into a lesson. She had taught that to her students before, just not these ones. In the teacher's lounge, she overheard faint murmurs about the group of seniors she was teaching. Apparently, they had a reputation, the kind of reputation that made substitutes quit by the second day. She sipped her coffee, letting their words wash over her without reaction. She'd faced opponents who tried to break her body in the ring. These were just teenagers trying to provoke her spirit. Still, she knew that the right kind of lesson often came not through reprimands, but through experience. She didn't plan to humiliate them back now. That wasn't her way, but she wouldn't allow disrespect to go unanswered, either. When she returned to the classroom after lunch, the atmosphere was different. The bullies were ready, waiting with a cruel gleam in their eyes. A rumor had already spread that Ms. Brooks was too soft to stand up for herself. The ringleader, a boy named Tyler, leaned back in his chair with arrogance, drumming his fingers against the desk. He whispered loudly enough for others to hear, mocking her voice and her clothes. The laughter grew louder. Ms. Brooks kept her focus on the lesson, flipping through her book, pretending not to notice. But she saw everything: their gestures, the smirks, the signals they exchanged. Things took a sharp turn when the final bell approached. A few students lingered behind as others left, pretending to clean up their desks. Ms. Brooks started packing her bag when suddenly, one of the boys accidentally bumped into her, spilling his drink across her sleeve. She froze, her jaw tightening, as laughter erupted. "Oh, sorry, miss," one of them said mockingly. "Didn't mean to mess up your outfit." Another chimed in, "Yeah, maybe next time, wear something stronger." Before she could respond, one of them reached out and tugged at her shirt, tearing the fabric at the shoulder. The sound of fabric ripping cut through the room, silencing even those who had been laughing. For a moment, everything stopped. Ms. Brooks stood still, her eyes locked on the one who did it. The smirk on his face faltered as he saw the calm fire. In her gaze, a gaze so steady it made the air feel heavier. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout or curse. Instead, she took a single deep breath, her expression unreadable. The students exchanged nervous glances. They had expected her to cry, or run, or lose control. Instead, she looked composed, almost frighteningly so. Slowly, she picked up the torn piece of fabric, folded it, and placed it neatly on her desk. Then she turned to them and said, Clean this mess up before you leave. Her tone was quiet, but it carried an authority that made even the boldest of them hesitate. When she walked out of that room, the bullies laughed again, but it was nervous laughter, forced, unsure. They didn't realize that what they had done had already set something in motion. In her mind, Ms. Brooks wasn't thinking about revenge. She was thinking about accountability. The incident didn't just bruise her pride. It became a test of who she was and what she stood for. Beneath her calm, her disciplined heart began to stir, reminding her of the strength she had spent years building through Taekwondo. She had mastered patience, control, and timing, the art of waiting for the right moment to act. The humiliation didn't defeat her. It awakened something sharper, something deliberate. That evening, as she sat at home in silence, she thought about those students, their arrogance, their ignorance, their belief that cruelty was power. She knew she couldn't simply report them and move on. That would teach them nothing. They needed to understand respect, not through punishment, but through realization. And in that quiet moment, she began to form the plan that would change everything that followed at Crestwood High. Ms. Brooks had always been a woman of discipline and balance, her life shaped by years of rigorous training that went far beyond physical strength. Long before she became a teacher, she had spent her evenings in a dimly lit gym, the rhythmic sound of her kicks echoing off padded walls. Sweat dripped on her face as she repeated each move with precision, her breath steady, her mind calm. Taekwondo wasn't just a sport to her, it was a philosophy, a way of living. She had trained under masters who taught her that true power lies not in aggression, but in control. Every strike, every stance, was a conversation between body and spirit. She learned how to channel her energy, how to face intimidation with composure, and how to find peace even in confrontation. Years of tournaments, black belt tests, and international championships had honed her into a national champion, someone whose focus and strength could silence a crowd. But she never sought fame. She sought understanding. Teaching, in her mind, was an extension of that same discipline, passing down lessons that shaped not just skill, but character. When she transitioned into education, many of her peers were surprised. How could a Taekwondo champion trade the thrill of competition for the quiet monotony of a classroom? But Ms. Brooks knew that true mastery meant being able to adapt, to use what she had learned in every part of life. Her martial arts background didn't make her violent or quick-tempered. It made her patient, aware, and deeply in tune with human nature. She could read body language as easily as words, sense intentions in silence, and diffuse tension with calm energy. Her students, however, had no idea who she truly was. They saw only a new teacher with a soft voice and kind smile, unaware of the iron discipline resting beneath her gentle exterior. When the bullying incident happened, Ms. Brooks didn't respond out of anger. She understood something deeper, that people act cruelly when they're insecure. That mockery often masks fear. The students who had humiliated her were not enemies. They were children who had never been truly held accountable for their actions. But still, she couldn't ignore the disrespect. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring balance. In her world, balance meant everything between strength and restraint, pride and humility, power and purpose. So when she stood in her living room that evening, staring at the torn shirt she had folded so carefully earlier, her mind returned to the principles she had lived by for years: respect, integrity, perseverance, self-control, and indomitable spirit. Each of those principles became her guide as she thought about what to do next. She didn't call the school board or report the students immediately. Instead, she decided to face the problem directly, just as she had faced countless opponents before. Not with fists, but with presence. The next morning she arrived early. The hallways were still empty, the fluorescent lights humming softly. She set down her things, rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, and began setting up her classroom differently. The usual rows of desks were rearranged into a circle. At the center, she placed a small wooden stand with a quote printed on it: "Control yourself, and you can control anything." She didn't write her name on the board that day. She didn't greet the class with a smile. She simply waited. When the students walked in, laughter filled the air again, though quieter than before. The memory of the previous day lingered like a shadow. They noticed the new arrangement but didn't understand it. Tyler smirked, pretending nothing had happened. Ms. Brooks looked at each of them in silence, her eyes calm but sharp. "Today," she said slowly, "we're going to talk about strength." The room quieted instantly. She began to move around the circle, her voice even and clear. "Some people think strength is loud," she said. "They think it's about who can make others afraid. But real strength is quiet. It doesn't need to prove itself." A few students exchanged confused glances. She continued, "I want to show you something." She took off her jacket, revealing a black belt wrapped around her waist. The gold lettering faded from years of use. The room went still. Then, with a single controlled motion, she struck her hand against the wooden stand, splitting it cleanly in half. The sound was sharp, echoing through the classroom. Gasps filled the air. Tyler's smirk vanished. "This," she said softly, "is focus. This is what happens when you spend years learning not to lose control, no matter what people do to you." She didn't brag about her titles or medals. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let her actions speak. The students watched in stunned silence as she explained how discipline was not about fighting others. but mastering oneself. Every time she demonstrated a move, a precise kick, a stance, a defensive shift, she connected it to a life principle: awareness, respect, patience. Slowly, the tension in the room began to dissolve. Those who had laughed at her the day before now sat upright, attentive, uncertain how to feel. She wasn't intimidating them. She was awakening something in them and understanding that strength could be graceful, that power could be silent. As the lesson went on, she asked them questions about what it meant to feel powerful, what it meant to be respected. Some hesitated to answer. Others spoke honestly for the first time, admitting they often felt invisible or angry. She listened without judgment, guiding the conversation toward empathy. Every word she spoke carried weight because it came from experience, not theory. The same control she had shown in competition now filled the classroom, commanding respect without demanding it. After class ended, a few students lingered behind. One of them, the same boy who had torn her shirt, approached her hesitantly. His voice was low, almost trembling. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know who you were." Ms. Brooks looked at him, her expression gentle but firm. "Now you do," she replied, "and now you know that who someone is isn't just what you see." She didn't lecture him further. She didn't need to. The silence between them carried more meaning than words ever could. That night, as she left the school, she passed by the trophy case near the main office. Among the awards for sports and academics, there was an empty shelf meant for student achievements. She paused, looking at her reflection in the glass, and thought about what victory truly meant. For her, it had never been about trophies or recognition. It was about transformation. The day's events reminded her why she had chosen to teach in the first place. She wanted to shape minds, not through fear, but through understanding. She wanted to show her students that resilience was not born from dominance, but from dignity. What the bullies had seen as a moment of weakness was, in truth, the calm before revelation. Ms. Brooks had not hidden her strength. She had simply chosen when to reveal it. Her Taekwondo past wasn't a secret of pride. It was a symbol of everything she stood for. In that classroom, she didn't just regain her respect, she redefined it. And while the students left that day whispering in awe, what stayed with them was not the memory of a broken board or a black belt. It was the quiet power of a woman who had nothing to prove, yet taught them everything about what true strength really was. The morning after her silent demonstration, the atmosphere in Crestwood High felt different. Word had spread like wildfire through the corridors. The quiet substitute teacher everyone had mocked was not who they thought she was. Whispers followed her wherever she walked. "She's a black belt. She broke a board with her bare hand. She's some kind of champion." But for Ms. Brooks, it wasn't about the rumor or the awe that followed. It was about what came next. She knew real change didn't come from shock or spectacle. It came from reflection, from facing one's actions and understanding their weight. The bullies had seen a glimpse of her strength, but they hadn't yet learned the lesson she intended to teach. She wasn't done with them, not out of vengeance, but because she wanted them to walk away with something that would stay for the rest of their lives that day. She began class with an unexpected tone. "We all make choices," she said calmly as the students settled into their seats. "And sometimes, those choices hurt people more than we realize. But the real question is, what do we do after that?" The students shifted uncomfortably. Tyler sat quietly at the back, his usual smirk gone. The memory of what he'd done still burned in his mind, though he tried to hide it. Ms. Brooks noticed, but she didn't single him out. Instead, she wrote one word on the board: respect. She asked them what it meant. A few hands went up hesitantly. Some gave textbook answers, treating others nicely, being polite, not interrupting. She nodded but then asked, "What does it mean when someone disrespects you? What do you do?" Silence filled the room. The same group of bullies that had once laughed at her now avoided her gaze. She waited patiently, the way she had been taught during sparring: never rush, never strike first, just allow the moment to unfold. Finally, one student spoke up softly, saying that most people would fight back, yell, or hit. Ms. Brooks smiled faintly. "That's one way," she said. "But there's another. When you know who you are, when you've trained your mind and heart, you don't need to fight back to prove your worth. Respect begins when you stop letting others control your peace." Her words struck something deep within the class. She didn't scold or shame anyone, but her calmness carried a weight that made everyone reflect. Then she surprised them all by inviting the entire class to the gym for the next lesson. The students followed, whispering among themselves, unsure of what to expect. The gym was empty, its floor shining under the fluorescent lights. A wide open space that suddenly felt far more intimidating than the classroom. Ms. Brooks walked to the center. Carrying a small bag, she laid it down and pulled out 2 sets of foam training pads and a pair of light gloves. "Today," she said, "we're going to talk about control." She demonstrated a simple stance, her movements fluid and graceful. "This," she said, "is where it begins. Control of your body, your breath, your thoughts." She called for volunteers. At first, no one moved, but then one of the quieter students stepped forward. She taught him how to hold the pad, how to position his arms, and how to maintain focus. Then she demonstrated a single, swift kick, precise and powerful, the sound echoing through the room. The students gasped. She smiled gently and said, "That's not strength. That's discipline. Strength is what keeps you from using this when you're angry. She invited a few more students to try, guiding their movements, correcting their balance. Soon the nervous laughter turned into concentration. Even Tyler, who had been avoiding her gaze, started watching closely. Finally, she turned to him and asked, "Would you like to try?" The question hung in the air, heavy but not hostile. He hesitated before nodding. As he stepped forward, she handed him the gloves. "You don't need to fight," she said softly. "Just focus. This isn't about power. It's about awareness." She showed him how to control his breathing, how to align his stance, and when he struck the pad, it barely made a sound. "Again," she said gently, but this time, with intention. He tried again, and this time the impact was stronger. The other students clapped lightly, encouraging him. Ms. Brooks smiled and said, "See the difference? Control gives you strength, not anger." Tyler lowered his hands slowly, a conflicted look in his eyes. He mumbled, "I didn't know you could do all this." She looked at him, her tone steady but kind. "There's a lot you don't know about people, Tyler, and that's why respect matters." The room grew quiet again. Every student could feel the shift not just in tone, but in understanding. After class, Ms. Brooks gathered them together. She spoke about her journey, about growing up facing prejudice and underestimation, about how Taekwondo gave her the strength not to fight the world, but to rise above it. She told him how every belt she earned wasn't just a symbol of physical skill, but of personal growth. "Every time I trained," she said, "I was taught that strength without respect is chaos. You can be powerful, but if you don't respect others, that power destroys you from within." Her words resonated deeply, especially with those who had once mocked her. The bullies who once saw her as an easy target now looked at her as someone they wished they could understand. In the days that followed, the change in the classroom was visible. The laughter that once filled the air at her expense was replaced by attentiveness and quiet admiration. Students began arriving early, greeting her respectfully, eager to learn not just about literature, but about life. Even the bullies started helping others, slowly shifting from arrogance to awareness. Tyler, the ringleader, began staying after class to ask questions not about Taekwondo, but about how she stayed so composed even when humiliated. Ms. Brooks told him the truth that she had felt anger, pain, and disappointment, but had learned long ago that emotions didn't have to define her actions. One afternoon, she found a small note left on her desk. It read, "I'm sorry for what I did. You didn't deserve it. Thank you for not giving up on us." There was no name, but she didn't need one. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. She folded the note quietly and placed it in her planner. She didn't respond or call attention to it. Forgiveness didn't need an audience. She had already forgiven them the moment she chose to teach rather than retaliate. From that point on, Ms. Brooks became more than just a teacher to her students. She became a figure of resilience, a living example of what strength truly looks like. The story of what happened that week spread throughout the school, not as gossip, but as inspiration. Teachers whispered about the change in those once unruly students. The principal even asked her to start a self-defense and mindfulness program after school, something that would help other students find confidence without aggression. On the final day of the semester, Ms. Brooks stood in the gym once again, this time surrounded by students practicing the very techniques she had shown them. The echo of focused strikes filled the air, not from violence, but from empowerment. She watched them move balanced, controlled, focused and felt something stir inside her. The bullies who had once torn her shirt now bowed respectfully before beginning their drills. The lesson had been learned. Respect was no longer just a word written on the board. It had become a truth they all lived by. And for Ms. Brooks, that was victory enough.